Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know that over the years I've served on the committee, I think this has probably been for you the issue that you're most passionate about. You put a lot of work into it. And of course, our leader has done that as well. So like a lot of us, it's been said that I'm disappointed that we couldn't find a way to work this together. My amendment, I think, will make a big difference. I've served for many years on the local chamber with 2,600 members in a smaller community, state chamber and federal chamber. There's three things. I'm going to read my points here, but before I get into that, here's what we're talking about: mandates, tax penalties, and then we're talking about 6 employees or more. It's going to save you a lot of heartache if we go down this road for a guy that understands probably as much as anybody small business, and a lot of businesses that have 6 employees or 8, they're struggling. They're just barely hanging on. American small businesses have been among the hardest hit by global pandemic, and many are still struggling today. In July last year, 43% of small businesses had to temporarily close across the country. 60% of the businesses that closed did not reopen. And halfway through this year, 64% of small businesses are concerned about the impact of COVID on their business. The last thing we need to do is a new mandate from Washington. The committee has already done bipartisan work to expand auto enrollment while protecting small business. As Ranking Member Brady said, we all vote unanimously to approve this bill. Yet Democrats have reversed course. Their partisan proposal would create a new mandate for employers with as few as 6 employees and a tax penalty if they don't comply. It seems to me a little bit like deja vu. But this creates headaches and a new cost for Main Street, and these employers don't have the same resources as bigger companies do. My amendment is very simple. It protects every employer in America who has 50 or fewer employees. I think that's where we need to start today. It also protects and supports minorities, women, and veterans-owned businesses as a carve-out. If Democrats are now rejecting the bipartisan policy they voted to approve earlier this year, the least we can do to protect American small business is from this new mandate. I urge adoption on this amendment, and I yield back.
Is there anyone who wishes to be heard on the gentleman's amendment? The gentleman from Philadelphia, Mr. Evans, is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly understand what the gentleman is attempting to do. However, nearly half of American private sector employees, roughly 55 million, work for an employer that does not offer a retirement plan. Latino, Asian, Black populations are less likely to have access to work-sponsored retirement plans. More than 52% of Black Americans and more than 2/3, 68% of Latino lack the opportunity to save in the workplace retirement plan, compared to 40% of white Americans. As a result, 56% of Black families and 2/3 of Latino have zero retirement saving, compared with about 1/3 of white families. These numbers have ballooned for 4 years. So we're going to address the coverage gap, which must ensure that most American workers have an opportunity to save for retirement at work. We need to require employers to facilitate an automatic enrollment in RA for employees. We certainly are sensitive to making it easy as possible for small employers. We are carved out for the small employers and for those in business for less than 2 years. The proposal includes a tax credit that will cover any cost to the employers. There's no requirement for the employer contribution. The reality is this: it will be easier for the employee to set up. It won't require much more than that. But what we want to provide is saving opportunity to as many employees as possible, and having a retirement plan at work to require purpose for financial security requirements. I also want to again point to the results of this legislation. Mr. Stagnant, it's important to understand, Mr. Chairman, as you have taking up this space, and I've been strongly supportive of you since I've been on this committee to recognize the importance. So I think what the gentleman's offered, would be not proper in this particular case, would not be helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Rice wishes to be heard. I just wanted to respond to the gentleman from Philadelphia there. You know, to say that people they don't have access to retirement plans is just not true. I mean, anybody can contribute to an IRA up to $6,000, up to 100% of their earnings. Anybody can do that right now without putting mandates on small businesses. You know, you say, well, it's not much of a burden. Well, it's not much of a burden that you have to go to a lawyer and file articles of organization for a LLC or articles of incorporation for a corporation. It's not much of a burden that you have to file an SS4 with the IRS or a S election with the IRS if you have an S corporation. It's not much of a burden that you have to spend hours and hours and hours filing your income taxes every year. It's not much of a burden that you have to do 1099s to anybody you pay $600 or more to, and W-2s, and payroll taxes, and payroll returns. It's not much of a burden that you have to hire CPAs and lawyers to do all this for you. It's not much of a burden now that you're going to want them to go and hire other lawyers or other accountants to do retirement plans for you. It's not much of a burden that you're going to have now, under this terms of this, to deal with insurance companies to require that they offer annuities as an option and to take on the liability of that and to pay the premiums, exorbitant premiums for these annuities. You know, it sounds great if you're talking about a law firm that employs 25 people or 50 people. Sounds great if you're talking about a firm that has 100 employees and the tools to do this. But what you're talking about here with these firms that employ 5 people, you're talking about landscapers. You're talking about plumbers. You're talking about restaurateurs. You're talking about the fabric of America that really has no expertise in this, no idea how to do all this. And you're compounding the effort. You're compounding the detail. You're compounding the cost of the professional services. You're compounding the regulatory burden. You're compounding the difficulty that these people with no expertise who have a terrible, you know, who have they want to be entrepreneurs. They're excited about the chance to open a new business, but then they face this daunting task of jumping through all these big government requirements that come out of Washington every year. And this $3.5 trillion bill, of which what we're talking about here is just one small part, is going to exponentiate the problems that these people face when, in truth, everybody has access to a retirement plan. It's just whether they choose to accept it or not. Everybody can contribute up to 100% of their earnings, up to $6,000 a year into an IRA and get a deduction for that. So I just don't believe that the burden that we're placing on small entrepreneurs with no expertise in this, I'm just not sure that it justifies what we're going to get out of this, which is only what we're going to get out of this is optional auto enrollment that they can opt out of anyway. I'm not sure that the burden we're placing on these small businesses is enough. Now, maybe when our next panel of witnesses comes up, where we can ask some of the experts about what they think about the burden and how it's going to affect the formation of small businesses. Maybe we can ask, is the NFIB coming up in the witness panel next, Mr. Chairman? Maybe we can ask them about what they believe is going to be the cost in terms of the economy in adopting this. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me go to Mr. Thompson. Does the gentleman insist on
Thank
his
you,
point of
Mr.
order?
Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my point of order.
Is there anybody else who wishes to be heard on Mr. Buchanan's amendment? Hearing none. Question is on Mr. Buchanan's amendment. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Can I ask for a recorded vote?
Mr. Brady and Mr. Buchanan have both requested a recorded vote, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett?
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson?
Thompson, no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer?
Blumenauer votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kind?
Kind, no.
Mr. Kind votes no. Mr. Pascarell?
Pascarell, no.
Mr. Pascarell votes no. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez?
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins?
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell?
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene?
Delbene votes no.
Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu?
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore? Mr. Kildee?
Kildee votes no.
Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle?
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle?
Boyle votes no. Boyle
Mr.
votes
Byer? Mr. Byer? Mr. Evans?
Evans votes no.
Boyle
Mr.
votes
Evans
no.
votes no. Mr. Schneider?
Mr. Schneider votes no, and I can hear Boyle saying no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi?
No.
Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Panetta? No. Mr. Panetta votes no. Miss Murphy?
Murphy votes no.
Miss Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez? Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Miss Plaskett?
Plaskett votes nay.
Miss Plaskett votes nay. Mr. Brady?
Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez?
Nunes votes aye.
Mr. Nunez votes aye. Mr. Buchanan?
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska?
Smith of Nebraska votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed?
Reed votes aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice? Aye. Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert votes yes. Ms. Walorski?
Yes.
Ms. Walorski votes yes. Mr. LaHood?
Yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Dr. Wenstrup?
Yes.
Dr. Wenstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington?
Yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson? Mr. Estes?
Estes votes yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker? Aye. Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn?
Aye.
Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mrs. Miller?
Aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Miss Moore?
Moore votes no.
Miss Moore votes no. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle?
Boyle votes no.
Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Byer?
Mr. Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez votes no. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Would the clerk report the tally?
Mr. Chairman, I have 25 nays and 18 ayes.
There being 25 noes and 18 ayes, the amendment fails.